I was much more comfortable in London because, you know, the language was the same, the church customs were the same. So we lived in Grosvenor Square while we were there, and John had his first audience with King George III. He was a little nervous, but he actually thought it went well. The press, however, was not nice to John at all. They said that he had been tongue-tied during the audience and that he was a traitor. While John was making business calls, Abby and I went to Westminster Abbey to hear this fabulous performance of Handel's Messiah. We also went to the Royal Theatre on Drury Lane to see many of Shakespeare's plays. On Sundays, we would drive outside of London to hear Richard Price preach because he was from the Puritan group of people, and he was very sympathetic to the American cause, and his sermons were very instructive. Living in London was very expensive, and Congress did not pay us for giving diplomatic dinners at all. And so we actually announced one, and we were really lucky because a ship came from New England, and they gave John two presents, a giant cod and a giant turtle, both of which were classic entrees in a classic New England dinner. John was asked to negotiate 2 more loans from Holland before we went home. Thomas Jefferson joked with him, and he said that when John was on his way to heaven, God would say, no, not until you negotiate 1 more loan from Holland for the United States. While we were in Holland, I bought some kitchen tiles to put in my new home. They were Delft tiles, and I thought they were very pretty. When we arrived in Boston, we thought we would be able to kind of sneak in to the United States, but John Hancock, who had been my John's boyhood friend, was now the governor of Massachusetts, and he had formed this big celebration. There were thousands of people waiting in the port, and they were all screaming, and there were church bells chiming and cannons booming. We rode home with John in his carriage, but we were anxious to get to our own home, which Cotton Tuss, my cousin, had purchased for us. We remembered it as a mansion, but when we actually saw it, it looked more like a wren's nest. So we had to spend many years with carpenters, but finally, Peacefield looked like this. And John's library looked like this. Then we heard that John was going to be nominated as the Vice President of the United States because Washington, who was hands down favorite to be president, was from the South and John was from the North. Made a balanced team. Thomas Jefferson became the first Secretary of State. John Jay, my husband's, John's fellow negotiator for the Treaty of Paris, was named the Chief Justice for the Supreme Court, and fellow lawyer Alexander Hamilton was named the first Secretary of the Treasury. When we moved to New York, all the houses in New York were too expensive, so John found this house called Richmond Hill. It was unfurnished, so I had to crate up our furniture and our china and our linen to bring it to Richmond Hill, and I had to bring our son Charles along with me too because he had gotten into trouble at Harvard. Somehow, during his last semester, he was running around with students who drank quite a bit. And one day when they were all drunk, they decided that they were going to take place in a social revolt, and in order to do that, they took off all their clothes and ran across the Harvard yard completely naked. So now Charles was staying with us. I began to make and receive calls, and whenever there were parties, called levees in those times, Martha Washington would be in one place and I would be directly to her right. John was a convincing speaker. Remember, I told you how much he likes to talk. Except that when he presided over the Senate, he was not supposed to take part in any of the debate. And he had opinions and he wanted people to know them. But he had a hard time remaining silent, but he finally learned. And in order to keep order, he would just tap gently on the mahogany table in front of him with this silver pencil case. Benjamin Franklin called his position his superfluous excellency, and the press called him often his rotundity. When the government moved to Philadelphia, we had to make yet another move, and we found this place called Bush Hill. It was so cold in Bush Hill in the wintertime that often I found my servants drunk. We went to a lot of parties, teas. The president would invite us to the theater. We would invite them to come and have dinner with us. But then the French Revolution broke out, caused all kinds of problems, not only in France, but in the United States, because two parties began to emerge. John and George and Alexander Hamilton felt that we should have a strong central government and that we should not ally ourselves with France. They didn't like the way the French Revolution was going, and all their viewpoints were printed in the newspaper on the left. But Thomas Jefferson believed that there should be strong states' rights. And he thought that since France helped with our revolution, we should help with theirs. And his viewpoints were printed in the newspaper on the right. All that activity during John's second term, during John's first term as vice president, made me so ill and exhausted that I didn't come to Philadelphia during John's second term. I was worried about spending too much money anyway. So John just roomed with one of the other members of Congress. He presided over the Senate. He read, and he wrote letters. Thankfully, a lot of them were to me. In August of 1793, thousands of people fell ill with yellow fever. There were so many sick people that they made Bush Hill, where we used to live, into an emergency hospital to see if they could save some lives. John came home to stay with me during that time, and we read in the newspaper that Thomas Jefferson had resigned as Secretary of State because he had so many arguments with Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton. John Jay was sent by President Washington to Great Britain to negotiate yet another peace treaty because he was afraid that since France had helped us with our revolution, that we might be sympathetic to the French during their revolution. And John Jay did come back with a peace treaty, but it was controversial because there were a lot of problems with this. However, when the Senate couldn't decide, there was a tie vote about whether to approve this peace treaty or not. John voted to support the administration. 31 times he did that. He was always supportive of the administration, more than any other vice president in the history of the United States. He traveled 29,000 miles, more than any other person up to that point, in support of his country, and he hadn't even reached his political pinnacle, which Mike Lockett will tell you about.